You'll get nothing, my brother laughed when I asked about Dad's will. The business goes to me, the house goes to me. You're just the daughter who makes pottery for a living. He had already started redecorating Dad's office before the funeral. Then the lawyer opened the envelope and my brother's face went completely white. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Miranda Cole, and I am 32 years old. I have spent the last 8 years building a ceramic studio in the Arts District of Portland, Oregon, creating custom pieces for restaurants, hotels, and private collectors. What started as a passion project in a rented garage has grown into a legitimate business with 3 employees and a waiting list that extends 6 months out. I work with my hands every day, shaping clay into functional art that people actually use and cherish. My pieces have been featured in design magazines, and I have established relationships with interior designers across the Pacific Northwest who regularly commission work for their high-end clients. I never expected to become an artist. Growing up, I was the practical one in the family, the daughter who helped my father with bookkeeping for his construction company every weekend while my older brother Chase spent his time playing sports and socializing. Dad ran Cole Construction, a mid-sized residential building company that he had founded 23 years ago, when I was just 9 years old. He started with himself and 2 employees, taking on small renovation projects and gradually building a reputation for quality work that came in on schedule and within budget. By the time I graduated high school, Cole Construction employed 15 people and was handling full custom home builds for wealthy clients in the suburbs. Chase is 4 years older than me, and we have always had a complicated relationship. As children, we got along well enough, but as we grew into adults, our differences became more pronounced. He inherited Dad's height and build, standing at 6 feet 2 inches with broad shoulders that seemed designed for the construction site. He played football in high school and college, though he never quite made it to the professional level he had dreamed about. After graduating with a business degree that Dad paid for, Chase came to work for Cole Construction in what was supposed to be an entry-level position, learning the business from the ground up. That lasted approximately 3 months before Dad promoted him to project manager, and then another 6 months before he became operations director. Chase had a talent for talking to clients and presenting well in meetings, and Dad was proud to have his son working alongside him. I understood that dynamic. Fathers and sons in the construction business, that was a traditional narrative that made sense to everyone who met them. Nobody questioned whether Chase had earned his rapid advancement, or whether he actually understood the technical aspects of the work. He looked the part, and that seemed to be enough. I took a different path entirely. After graduating from Portland State University with a degree in fine arts, I spent 2 years working in a gallery while taking evening classes in ceramics at a community studio. I discovered that I loved the meditative quality of working with clay, the way that throwing a pot on the wheel required complete focus and presence. There was something deeply satisfying about taking formless material and shaping it into something beautiful and useful. I started selling pieces at local craft fairs and farmers markets, and gradually built up enough of a customer base to rent my own studio space. Dad was supportive of my artistic pursuits, even though I could tell he did not entirely understand them. He would visit my studio and look at my work with genuine interest, asking questions about my process and my customers. He bought pieces as gifts for Mom on birthdays and anniversaries, and he commissioned a custom set of dinnerware that became one of my proudest achievements. He never pressured me to join Cole Construction, never suggested that my path was less valid than Chase's simply because it was different. That acceptance meant everything to me during the early years when I was barely making enough money to cover rent and materials. My mother passed away 6 years ago after a brief and brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. She went from diagnosis to death in 4 months, leaving all of us reeling from the speed of it. Dad threw himself into work, putting in 12 and 14-hour days as a way of avoiding the empty house that used to be filled with her presence. Chase stepped up during that time, taking on more responsibility at the company, and genuinely helping Dad manage both the business operations and his grief. I was proud of my brother during those months. He showed a level of maturity and compassion that I had not always seen from him. But something shifted after Mom died. Chase started talking about the company differently, using phrases like "when I take over" and "my vision for the future." in ways that presumed an outcome that had never been explicitly discussed. Dad was only 58 years old when Mom died, hardly retirement age for a man who loved his work and had no hobbies outside of it. Yet Chase spoke as though Dad's departure from active leadership was imminent and inevitable, and as though his own succession was already decided. The relationship between Dad and Chase became more complicated over the following years. There were disagreements about company direction, about which projects to take on, about hiring decisions and expansion plans. Dad wanted to maintain the company's reputation for quality and careful attention to detail, even if that meant turning down projects that would have been more profitable, but also more rushed. Chase wanted to grow faster, take on more jobs, hire more crews, and maximize revenue. Their arguments about business strategy became more frequent and more heated. I stayed out of those conflicts. Coal construction was their world, not mine. I had my own business to run, my own challenges to navigate. I would have Sunday dinners with Dad where he would sometimes vent about frustrations at work, and I would listen and offer what perspective I could, but I never imagined that these business disputes would eventually involve me directly. 18 months ago, Dad was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. He had never smoked a day in his life, which made the diagnosis feel particularly cruel and arbitrary. The oncologist explained that environmental exposure to construction materials over decades might have been a contributing factor, or it might simply be terrible luck. Either way, the prognosis was not good. He started chemotherapy immediately, determined to fight, but the treatment was brutal and the results were disappointing. Dad continued working as much as he could between treatment sessions, though his energy was clearly diminished. He started coming into the office for half days instead of full days, delegating more responsibilities to Chase and to the senior project managers who had been with the company for years. Chase stepped into the leadership void with enthusiasm, making decisions and setting direction in ways that sometimes aligned with Dad's vision, and sometimes did not. I increased my visits home during Dad's illness, driving across town to have dinner with him several times a week. We would sit in the house where I grew up, eating meals that neighbors and church members had dropped off, and we would talk about everything except the cancer that was slowly killing him. He asked about my business, about specific commissions I was working on, about my employees and my plans for expansion. He told me stories about building the company, about mistakes he had made and lessons he had learned, about the satisfaction of creating something lasting. During one of these conversations about 6 months before he died, Dad mentioned that he had been working on updating his will and estate planning documents. He said he wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, that there would be no confusion or conflict after he was gone. I told him I did not want to talk about it, that he was going to beat the cancer and we would have many more years together. He smiled at my optimism but said that responsible men plan for all outcomes, and he wanted to be responsible. Chase became increasingly proprietary about the business during Dad's final months. He started referring to coal construction as my company in conversations with employees and clients, despite the fact that Dad was still the sole owner and still technically in charge. He made plans for expansion that Dad had explicitly said he did not want to pursue. He talked about changing the company name to something more modern that did not have coal in it at all, which seemed to me like an erasure of everything Dad had built. I mentioned these concerns to Dad during one of our dinners, telling him that I was worried about what would happen to his legacy after he was gone. He listened carefully and then said something that stuck with me. He said that a man's legacy is not just about the business he builds, but about the values he instills in his children, and the choices he makes about what matters most. At the time, I thought he was being philosophical in the way that people facing mortality often become. I did not realize he was trying to tell me something specific. Dad passed away on a Tuesday morning in late September, with Chase and me both at his bedside. He had been in hospice care at home for the previous 2 weeks, and we had known the end was approaching. He drifted away peacefully, which felt like a small mercy after months of painful treatment. Chase and I cried together, holding hands across Dad's bed, united in grief if nothing else. The funeral was large, with over 200 people attending the service at the Methodist church where my parents had been members for decades. Employees from coal construction came, along with subcontractors, suppliers, clients, neighbors, and friends from every phase of Dad's life. Person after person approached me to share stories about my father's integrity, his fairness, his willingness to help people who were struggling, and his commitment to doing things the right way even when the wrong way would have been easier or more profitable. Chase delivered the eulogy, speaking about Dad as a businessman and a mentor, emphasizing the company they had built together, and the lessons Dad had taught him about leadership. It was a good speech, heartfelt and genuine, but I noticed that it focused almost entirely on the last 10 years when Chase had been working alongside Dad. There was very little about Dad's earlier life, about his relationship with Mom, about his role as a father to both of us, or about the values that had guided him outside of business contexts. After the funeral, there was a reception at the house where dozens of people came through to offer condolences and share memories. I spent hours accepting hugs and listening to stories, feeling exhausted and hollowed out by grief. Chase was in his element, working the room like a networking event, thanking people for coming and assuring employees that Cole Construction would continue to thrive under his leadership. I heard him tell at least 5 people that he was planning to expand the company significantly now that he would have the freedom to pursue his own vision. The certainty in his voice troubled me. Dad's will had not been read yet. The estate had not been settled. Yet Chase was already speaking as though everything had been decided, as though the transfer of power was a mere formality that would confirm what he already knew to be true. I tried to dismiss my unease as emotional sensitivity, as grief making me see problems where none existed. Chase was my brother. Surely he would not be so presumptuous unless he had good reason to be confident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The following morning, I went to Dad's home office to begin the overwhelming task of sorting through his personal papers. The office was a small room off the main hallway, lined with bookshelves filled with construction manuals, business books, and family photo albums. Dad's desk was covered with mail that had accumulated during his final weeks in hospice, and I started organizing it into piles of bills to be paid, correspondence to be answered, and junk to be discarded. I was about halfway through this sorting process when Chase walked in without knocking. He had a measuring tape in his hand and was looking around the room with an appraising eye that immediately set me on edge. "What are you doing?" I asked, looking up from the stack of mail I had been sorting. "Measuring the office," Chase replied, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. "I am thinking about converting this into a home gym. The house is mine now, so I might as well start planning the renovations I want to do." I stared at him, uncertain whether he was joking or genuinely this insensitive. "The house is yours? Dad's will has not even been read yet." Chase laughed, a sound that held more condescension than humor. "Come on, Miranda. You cannot actually think Dad left you the house. You have your own place. You have your little pottery business. I am the one who worked alongside him for 10 years. I am the one who is going to run Cole Construction. Obviously the house comes with the business. That is just how these things work." "How these things work?" I repeated, feeling anger beginning to rise through my grief. "Dad has been gone for exactly 3 days, and you are already measuring his office for renovation?" "I am being practical," Chase said, his tone shifting from amused to defensive. "Someone has to think about the logistics here. The estate is going to take months to settle. I need to start planning now if I want to have everything ready when I officially take over." "Take over what exactly? You are making a lot of assumptions about things that have not been decided yet." Chase rolled his eyes and sat down in Dad's desk chair, leaning back in a way that suggested ownership and authority. "Miranda, let's be realistic here. Dad built a construction company. I worked in construction. You make ceramic bowls. Who do you think he left the business to?" The dismissiveness in his voice when he said ceramic bowls stung more than I wanted to admit. My work was not just bowls, and even if it were, there was no shame in creating functional art that brought beauty into people's daily lives. But this was not the time to defend my career choices. This was about something larger. "I have no interest in running Cole Construction," I said carefully. "I never said I did. But you do not know what Dad's wishes were any more than I do until the will is read. Making plans and measuring rooms and telling people the company is yours seems premature and disrespectful." "Disrespectful?" Chase stood up, his face flushing with anger. "I spent 10 years working 70-hour weeks to build that company alongside Dad. I earned this. You cannot just show up after barely being involved and start questioning my right to take over what I helped create." I am not questioning anything. I am asking you to wait until we actually know what Dad wanted before you start acting like everything is already decided. Chase walked toward the door, then turned back to look at me with an expression that was equal parts pity and contempt. You know what your problem is, Miranda? You have never understood how business works. You have never understood legacy and succession. Dad knew that I was the only one who could carry on what he built. You will get something, I am sure. Maybe some money, maybe some sentimental items. But the real assets, the business in this house, those go to the person who can actually use them. That person is me. He left before I could respond, leaving me sitting in Dad's office surrounded by the papers and books and photographs that documented a life spent building something meaningful. I looked around at the space that Chase had already mentally converted into a home gym, erasing Dad's presence before his body was even cold in the ground. That evening, I received a call from Robert Chen, Dad's attorney. He asked if I could come to his office the following afternoon for the reading of the will. He said that Chase had already confirmed his attendance, and that there were some matters that needed to be addressed with both of us present. His tone was professional and careful, giving nothing away about what the will contained. I spent that night unable to sleep, running through scenarios in my mind. Chase had seemed so certain, so confident that everything would go to him. Was that confidence based on conversations with Dad that I had not been privy to? Had Dad told him explicitly that he would inherit everything? Or was Chase simply assuming based on gender and traditional expectations about fathers and sons in family businesses? I thought about all those dinners with Dad during his illness, all those conversations about values and legacy and what matters most. Had he been trying to tell me something without stating it directly? Or had I been reading meaning into words that were simply the philosophical musings of a dying man? The next afternoon, I drove to Robert Chen's law office in downtown Portland. The building was an older structure that had been renovated into modern office space, and Chen's suite was on the 4th floor with windows overlooking the Willamette River. I arrived 15 minutes early, nervous and uncertain about what I was about to hear. Chase was already there, sitting in the waiting area wearing a suit and looking relaxed and confident. He nodded at me when I walked in but did not speak. The tension between us from our argument in Dad's office hung in the air, unaddressed and uncomfortable. Robert Chen emerged from his office exactly at the appointed time. He was a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a kind face that had probably comforted many grieving families through difficult legal processes. He shook both our hands and invited us into his conference room, where he had already laid out several documents on the large table. "Thank you both for coming," Chen began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I appreciate your willingness to address these matters promptly. Your father was very clear about his wishes, and he updated his will and estate planning documents several times over the past year to ensure everything was exactly as he wanted it." Chase leaned forward, his expression attentive and serious. I sat back in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, trying to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. "Let me begin by saying that your father loved you both very much," Chen continued. "He spoke often about his pride in your different accomplishments and the different paths you have chosen. He wanted me to make sure you understood that the decisions reflected in his will were not about loving one child more than the other, but about doing what he believed was right given the specific circumstances of his assets and your individual situations." This preamble made my stomach tighten with anxiety. It sounded like the introduction to news that someone was going to find disappointing. Chun opened the folder in front of him and began reading the formal language of the will. There were specific bequests of personal items, Dad's wedding ring to Chase, Mom's jewelry to me, various pieces of furniture and artwork divided between us in ways that seemed thoughtful and fair. Then Chun reached the section about the major assets and everything changed. "To my son Chase Cole, I leave the sum of $50,000 in my Toyota pickup truck, free and clear of any encumbrances. I further direct that he be given the first opportunity to apply for any open positions at Cole Construction under the new ownership, provided he is qualified and willing to work under the same terms and conditions as any other employee." The silence in the room was profound. Chase had gone completely still, his face frozen in an expression of confusion and disbelief. Chun continued reading, his voice steady and professional. "The entirety of Cole Construction, including all assets, contracts, equipment and real estate, I leave to my daughter Miranda Cole, along with the house at 847 Maple Street and all its contents. I make this bequest knowing that Miranda has no interest in running a construction company herself, and I trust her judgment completely in deciding the best future for the business I spent my career building. I could not process what I was hearing. The words made no sense. Why would Dad leave me a construction company I knew nothing about? Why would he leave Chase, who had worked alongside him for 10 years, with essentially nothing? Chase found his voice first. That cannot be right. There must be a mistake. Read it again. Chun looked at him with professional sympathy. There is no mistake, Chase. I can read the relevant sections again if you would like, but the disposition of assets is very clear. Miranda inherits Cole Construction and the house. You receive $50,000 in the vehicle, plus the opportunity for employment. Employment. Chase's voice was rising, his face flushing red. I built that company. I spent 10 years of my life working alongside Dad every single day. Miranda knows nothing about construction. She cannot even use a power drill. This is insane. Dad would never have done this. Your father was of sound mind when he executed this will, Chun said calmly. I met with him multiple times over the past year, and I can attest that he understood exactly what he was doing and why. Chase turned to look at me, his expression a mixture of fury and betrayal. You did this. You manipulated him somehow. You spent all that time having dinner with him during his illness, and you convinced him to cut me out. I had no idea, I said, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. I never discussed the will with Dad. I never asked him for anything. I am as shocked as you are. Shocked. Chase stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. You are shocked that you just inherited millions of dollars worth of assets? You expect me to believe that? Mr. Cole, Chun intervened, his voice firm. I understand this is not the outcome you expected, but I need to ask you to remain calm. There is more information that might provide some context for your father's decision, if you are willing to hear it. Chase sat back down, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Fine. Explain to me how I got disinherited from my own father's company. Chun pulled out another document, this one several pages long. Your father left detailed notes explaining his reasoning, which he asked me to share with you both if there were questions about his decisions. Would you like me to read them? Yes, Chase and I said simultaneously, though for very different reasons. Chun began reading from Dad's letter. To my children, if you are hearing this explanation, it means you have questions about how I chose to divide my estate. I want you to understand that these decisions came from a place of love, and a desire to do what I believed was truly best for everyone involved, even if it is not what you expected. The letter continued, and as Chun read Dad's words, the full picture of his thinking began to emerge. Dad had been paying attention, far more closely than any of us realized, to what was happening at Cole Construction during his illness. He knew about Chase's plans to expand aggressively. He knew about the business decisions Chase had been making that prioritized profit over the quality and integrity that had always defined the company. He had talked to longtime employees who were concerned about the direction things were heading. He had reviewed contracts that Chase had signed without proper approval, taking on projects that Dad considered risky or ethically questionable. Most significantly, Dad had discovered that Chase had been telling clients and employees that he was already the owner, that Dad had decided to step back and let Chase take over. This was not true. Dad had never made that decision. Chase had simply assumed it and started acting on that assumption, creating facts on the ground that Dad found deeply troubling. The letter was not cruel, but it was clear. Dad wrote that he had hoped Chase would grow into a leader who embodied the values that Cole Construction was built on. But instead, Chase had shown that he valued growth and profit over everything else. Dad could not leave his life's work to someone who would transform it into something unrecognizable, something that no longer reflected the principles that had guided every decision for 23 years. As for me, Dad wrote that he knew I had no interest in construction, but he trusted me to care more about his legacy and his employees than about maximizing profit. He believed I would make good decisions about what to do with the company, whether that meant finding the right person to buy it, bringing in professional management, or exploring other options that would preserve what he had built. By the time Chun finished reading, I had tears streaming down my face. Chase sat in complete silence, staring at the table. The letter was a repudiation of everything he thought he had earned, everything he believed himself entitled to. But it was also an expression of Dad's love and his desperate hope that somehow, even after his death, he could protect what he had spent his life creating. Chun gave us both a moment to absorb what we had heard, then spoke again. Your father also left instructions about the immediate management of Cole Construction. Miranda, you have the legal authority to make decisions about the company starting today. Chase, as I mentioned, you have the opportunity to continue working there if you choose, but that is entirely up to Miranda as the new owner. Chase stood up again, and this time his movements were slower, almost mechanical. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something beyond anger or hurt, something that looked almost like hatred. You will destroy it, he said quietly. You know nothing about running a construction company. You will make terrible decisions and everything Dad built will collapse within a year. But that is what you wanted, is it not? You could not stand that I had a relationship with Dad that you did not have, that I was part of something important while you played with clay. So you took it all away from me. Chase, I never wanted. I started, but he cut me off. I do not want to hear it. Enjoy your inheritance, Miranda. I hope it was worth destroying our relationship. He walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving me sitting there with Robert Chun and a pile of documents that had just changed everything about my life. Chun waited until he heard the outer door close before speaking again. This is often the hardest part of my job, watching families fracture over inheritance issues. For what it is worth, your father anticipated Chase's reaction. He hoped that eventually, once the initial shock wore off, Chase might understand why he made this choice. But he was not optimistic about that happening quickly. I wiped my eyes and tried to collect myself. What happens now? What am I supposed to do with a construction company? That is entirely up to you, Chin said. You have several options. You could hire a management team to run it while you learn more about the business. You could sell it, though your father's will includes a clause requesting that you try to find a buyer who will maintain the company's values and retain the current employees. You could explore bringing in a partner who has industry experience. Or you could simply take time to figure out what makes sense. The company is financially stable, and the senior project managers are capable of handling day-to-day operations for a while. I nodded, trying to focus on practical matters, rather than the emotional devastation of what had just happened with Chase. And the house? The house is yours outright. Chase will need to remove his belongings, but you have every right to take possession whenever you are ready. I would recommend giving him a reasonable timeline to collect his things, perhaps a week or two, just to avoid further conflict. As I drove home that evening, my mind was spinning with implications and questions and grief and confusion. I had come into that meeting expecting to hear that Chase would inherit everything, and I would receive some money and personal items. Instead, I had been given a multimillion-dollar construction company I had no idea how to run, a house I had not planned to live in, and a brother who now seemed to genuinely hate me. Dad had trusted me with his legacy, but I could not understand why. What had he seen in me that made him believe I was the better choice? What had he seen in Chase that made him willing to essentially disinherit his own son despite 10 years of working together? And most pressingly, what was I supposed to do now? The morning after the will reading, I woke up in my apartment above the ceramic studio feeling like I had lived through someone else's nightmare. The legal documents Robert Chun had given me were spread across my kitchen table, each page a reminder that my life had fundamentally changed in ways I had not chosen and did not understand. I made coffee and sat staring at those papers, trying to comprehend the weight of what had been placed on my shoulders. Cole Construction was now mine. The house on Maple Street where I had grown up was now mine. The responsibility for 37 employees and their families was now mine. Dad had made this decision with full knowledge that I had no experience in construction, no background in managing a company of this size, and no previous indication that I wanted anything to do with the family business. Yet he had trusted me with everything he had spent his life building, and that trust felt simultaneously like a gift and an impossible burden. I spent the entire day researching what it meant to own a construction company. I read articles about the industry, looked up information about business operations and management structures, and tried to educate myself on the basics of what Cole Construction actually did. The company's website showed completed projects ranging from custom homes to commercial renovations, all photographed beautifully to showcase the quality of workmanship. There were testimonials from satisfied clients praising the attention to detail and the professionalism of the crews. Everything about the online presence suggested a well-run organization with a strong reputation. But a website tells you nothing about the daily reality of operations, about cash flow and payroll and scheduling and client relationships, and the thousand other details that keep a business functioning. I felt completely out of my depth, drowning in information I could barely process. The logical part of my brain kept insisting that I should just sell the company to someone who actually knew what they were doing, take the money, and go back to my ceramic studio where I understood what I was creating and why. Yet every time I considered that option, I thought about Dad's letter and his explicit request that I try to find a buyer who would maintain the company's values and retain the employees. He had not just given me assets to liquidate. He had given me stewardship of something that mattered to him more than money, something that represented his life's work and his commitment to doing business with integrity. Simply selling to the highest bidder would be a betrayal of that trust, even if it would be easier. My phone had been buzzing all day with calls and messages that I had been ignoring. Most were from numbers I did not recognize, probably employees or clients who had heard about Dad's death and wanted to offer condolences or ask questions about the future. But there were also 3 calls from Chase that I had let go to voicemail. I was not ready to talk to him, not after the way he had looked at me in Robert Chen's office, not after his accusation that I had manipulated Dad into changing his will. Finally, late in the afternoon, I forced myself to listen to Chase's voicemails. The first 2 were angry, rambling messages about injustice and betrayal, about how I had stolen his inheritance and destroyed everything he had worked for. His voice was raw with hurt and rage, and listening to those messages made my chest tighten with guilt and sadness. Whatever our differences, Chase was still my brother, and hearing that level of pain in his voice was difficult to bear. The third message was different. His tone was calmer, more controlled, though I could hear the effort it took to maintain that control. He said we needed to talk about the business, that there were urgent matters that required immediate attention, and that regardless of our personal issues, the company needed leadership right now. He asked me to meet him at the coal construction office the next morning, so we could discuss the transition and make sure nothing fell through the cracks during this difficult time. The reasonableness of this request made me suspicious. Less than 24 hours ago, Chase had walked out of the lawyer's office saying he hoped my inheritance was worth destroying our relationship. Now he wanted to have a calm business meeting about transition planning. The sudden shift from fury to professional courtesy felt calculated, like a strategy rather than genuine acceptance of the situation. Still, he was right that the company needed attention. Dad had been sick for months, and while Chase had been handling day-to-day operations during that time, there was surely work that needed to be done to formalize the change in ownership. I could not just ignore the business and hope it would run itself. At some point, I needed to step up and take responsibility for what Dad had left me, even if I felt completely unprepared for that responsibility. I called Robert Chen to ask his advice about meeting with Chase. Chen listened to my concerns and then offered his perspective. He said that Chase's request was reasonable on its face, that there were indeed business matters that needed attention, but he also cautioned me to be careful about making any major decisions or signing any documents without legal review. He reminded me that I now owned the company outright, and that Chase had no legal authority over business operations, unless I explicitly granted him that authority. Chen offered to attend the meeting with me if I wanted legal representation present, but I declined. Having a lawyer at a meeting with my brother felt like an escalation I was not ready to initiate. That evening, I drove to the house on Maple Street for the first time since Dad's funeral. I parked in the driveway and sat in my car for several minutes, looking at the 2-story craftsman-style home where I had grown up. Dad had bought this house when I was 6 years old, after saving for years to afford a down payment. He had done much of the renovation work himself, updating the kitchen and bathrooms, refinishing the hardwood floors, and building the back deck where we had eaten countless family dinners during warm weather. This house represented stability and care and the rewards of hard work, and now it belonged to me. I used my old house key to let myself in, half expecting Chase to appear and challenge my right to be there. But the house was empty and quiet. I walked through the rooms slowly, remembering different phases of my childhood in each space. The living room where we had opened Christmas presents every year. The kitchen where Mom had taught me to bake cookies. The small office where Dad had reviewed blueprints and bid proposals every evening. My old bedroom upstairs, still containing the furniture from my teenage years, even though I had moved out over a decade ago. Chase's presence was evident throughout the house. His clothes filled the master bedroom closet. His toiletries were spread across the bathroom counter. His laptop and papers covered the dining room table, turning the formal space into a makeshift home office. He had clearly been living here during Dad's final illness and had made no move to find his own place even after Dad entered hospice care. The presumption implicit in that choice bothered me. Chase had moved into the master bedroom before Dad was even gone, claiming space and authority that had never been offered to him. I went into Dad's office and sat in his chair, the same chair where Chase had sat so confidently just days ago when he was measuring the room for his imagined home gym. The bookshelves were filled with construction industry publications, business management books, and 3-ring binders containing what appeared to be company records and project documentation. I pulled down one of the binders at random and flipped through pages of contracts, change orders, inspection reports, and correspondence with clients. The level of detail was overwhelming, each project generating dozens of documents that had to be reviewed, filed, and maintained. On Dad's desk was a framed photograph of our family from about 15 years ago, back when Mom was healthy and Chase and I were both young adults just beginning to figure out our paths in life. We were standing in front of this very house, all 4 of us smiling at the camera, looking like the picture of a happy and stable family. I picked up the frame and studied the image, trying to remember what life had felt like in that moment before illness and death and inheritance disputes had fractured everything we used to be. Underneath the photograph was a leather-bound journal that I had never seen before. I opened it carefully and realized it was Dad's personal diary, filled with his handwriting documenting thoughts and observations from the past several years. I knew I should probably not read it, that diaries were private even after death, but I could not resist the pull of wanting to understand his thinking during his final months. I flipped to entries from the last year of his life, after his cancer diagnosis. Dad wrote about his fear of dying, about his regrets and his gratitude, about his love for both Chase and me despite our very different relationships with him. He wrote about the business and his concerns about its future direction. And he wrote, in painful detail, about his growing realization that Chase was not the person he had hoped his son would become. One entry from 6 months before his death stood out. Dad described a conversation he had overheard between Chase and a potential client. The client had asked about sustainable building practices and environmentally responsible material sourcing, topics that Dad had been increasingly interested in as the construction industry evolved. Chase had dismissed these concerns as expensive and unnecessary, saying that clients who wanted that kind of thing should find a different contractor. Dad wrote that hearing his son casually reject values that he considered fundamental had broken something in him, had made him realize that Chase saw the business purely as a vehicle for profit, rather than as a reflection of personal integrity. Another entry described Dad's decision to hire a private investigator to review some of Chase's business dealings. This shocked me. I had no idea Dad had gone to such lengths, but apparently, he had become concerned enough about rumors and inconsistencies that he felt professional investigation was warranted. The investigator had discovered that Chase had been accepting kickbacks from certain subcontractors in exchange for awarding them contracts, a practice that was both unethical and potentially illegal. The amounts were not huge, perhaps $20,000 or $30,000 over 2 years, but the betrayal of trust was complete. Dad had confronted Chase about this, and Chase had admitted to it while insisting that everyone in the industry did the same thing and that Dad was being naive about how modern business worked. Reading these entries made my chest ache with sadness for Dad. He had wanted so badly to believe in Chase, to trust that his son would carry on his legacy with honor. Instead, he had discovered that Chase fundamentally disagreed with the principles that Dad considered non-negotiable. The decision to leave the company to me rather than to Chase had not been arbitrary or emotional. It had been based on concrete evidence that Chase could not be trusted to maintain the integrity that Cole Construction had been built on. I closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness of the office, processing what I had learned. Chase's anger at being disinherited made more sense now. He had probably convinced himself that his kickback scheme was normal business practice, that Dad's objections were old-fashioned and out of touch with how things really worked. When Dad died without forgiving him or restoring him to his expected position as heir, Chase must have felt both punished and misunderstood. His fury at me was misdirected blame, a way of avoiding responsibility for his own choices. But understanding Chase's perspective did not make the situation any easier to navigate. I still had to meet with him tomorrow. I still had to figure out how to run a company I knew nothing about. I still had to decide what to do with a house full of my brother's belongings and a business full of my brother's professional relationships. The knowledge from Dad's journal gave me context, but it did not give me a clear path forward. I spent the night at the Maple Street house, sleeping in my old bedroom rather than driving back to my apartment. It felt strange to be in that space again, surrounded by remnants of my teenage years, but also oddly comforting. This house held so many memories of the family we used to be before everything became complicated by illness and death, and conflicting visions of the future. The next morning, I dressed carefully in professional clothes that I hoped would help me feel more confident than I actually felt. I arrived at the Cole construction office at 8:30, half an hour before the time Chase had suggested for our meeting. The office was located in a light industrial area near the airport, occupying a converted warehouse space that housed both administrative offices and equipment storage. I had only been here a handful of times over the years, usually when stopping by to have lunch with Dad or to drop something off that he had forgotten at home. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s named Paula, looked up in surprise when I walked in. Her expression immediately shifted to sympathy and concern. She stood up and came around her desk to give me a hug, offering condolences about Dad's death and asking how I was holding up. I appreciated the genuine warmth in her greeting, the sense that people here had cared about my father and mourned his loss. Paula told me that Chase was already in Dad's office waiting for me. She hesitated before adding that she was glad I was here, that there had been a lot of uncertainty among the staff about what would happen to the company now that Dad was gone. I assured her that I would do my best to provide clarity and stability, even though I had no idea how I would actually accomplish that. I walked down the hallway to the large corner office that had been Dad's for over 20 years. The door was open, and I could see Chase sitting behind the desk, reviewing something on his laptop. He had made himself completely at home in the space, his jacket hanging on the coat rack, his coffee mug sitting on the desk blotter, his posture suggesting ownership and authority. When he saw me, he stood up and gestured to one of the chairs facing the desk, positioning himself as the person in charge of this meeting. I chose not to sit in the visitor's chair. Instead, I walked around to the other side of the desk, forcing Chase to move. He looked annoyed but stepped aside, and I settled into Dad's chair, claiming my position as the actual owner of this company. It was a small power play but an important one. If Chase was going to take me seriously, I needed to establish from the beginning that I was not going to defer to him simply because he had more experience. Chase sat down in one of the visitor chairs, his jaw tight with displeasure at this reversal of his expected dynamic. For a long moment we just looked at each other across the desk, years of sibling history and recent betrayal hanging between us in the silence. Finally Chase spoke. His tone was carefully controlled, professional rather than emotional. He said that regardless of our personal feelings about Dad's will, we both needed to think about the good of the company and its employees. Cole Construction had contracts in progress worth millions of dollars, projects that required consistent leadership and management to complete successfully. Clients needed to know that the company would continue to deliver quality work on schedule. Subcontractors and suppliers needed to know they would be paid. Employees needed to know their jobs were secure. All of this was true, and I appreciated that Chase was at least trying to focus on business rather than relitigating yesterday's arguments. I told him I understood the gravity of the situation, and that I wanted to learn as much as possible about how the company operated, so I could make informed decisions about its future. Chase leaned forward, his expression earnest. He said the smartest thing I could do would be to keep everything running exactly as it had been, with him continuing to manage operations while I learned the business from a distance. He had relationships with all the key clients, knew all the ongoing projects intimately, and had the trust of the employees who had worked alongside him for years. Trying to make changes or bring in outside management would create chaos and uncertainty that could damage the company's reputation and financial stability. The logic of his argument was seductive. I knew nothing about construction. Chase knew everything about this particular company's operations. Maintaining continuity made sense from a business perspective. Yet I could not forget what I had read in Dad's journal the night before, the evidence that Chase had been accepting kickbacks and the fundamental disagreement about values that had led Dad to disinherit him. Giving Chase free rein to run the company while I remained uninvolved would be abdicating the responsibility that Dad had specifically entrusted to me. I told Chase that I appreciated his willingness to help with the transition, but I needed to understand the business much more thoroughly before making any decisions about management structure. I said I would be spending significant time at the office over the coming weeks, meeting with employees, reviewing active projects, and learning about company operations from the ground up. I asked him to prepare detailed reports on all ongoing contracts, current financial status, and any outstanding issues that required immediate attention. Chase's expression shifted from earnest to irritated. He said that having me underfoot asking elementary questions would slow everything down and create confusion among the staff about who was actually in charge. He suggested that I trust his judgment and let him continue doing the job he had been doing successfully for the past several months while Dad was too sick to be actively involved. I held my ground, saying that as the owner, I had both the right and the responsibility to understand my own business. I was not trying to interfere with his work, but I was also not going to remain ignorant about how the company operated. If he found my presence disruptive, perhaps we needed to have a larger conversation about his role going forward. This veiled threat hung in the air between us. Chase understood perfectly well that I had the legal authority to fire him if I chose to, though doing so would create enormous practical problems given his knowledge of ongoing projects. His face flushed with anger that he was clearly working hard to suppress. He said he would prepare the reports I requested, though his tone suggested he considered this busy work rather than legitimate business need. Before I could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Paula poked her head in to say that Frank Morrison, one of the senior project managers, needed to speak with whoever was handling the Riverside development, as there was an urgent issue that had come up that morning. Chase started to stand, but I spoke first, telling Paula to send Frank in so we could address the issue together. Frank Morrison was a man in his early 60s with weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke to decades of construction work. He had been with Cole Construction for 17 years. One of the most senior and respected members of the team. He nodded at both Chase and me, his expression concerned but professional. He explained that the electrical inspector had red-tagged some of the work on the Riverside project that morning, saying that certain installations did not meet code requirements and would need to be completely redone. This was going to delay the project by at least 2 weeks and cost approximately $40,000 in additional labor and materials. Chase immediately jumped in, saying that the inspector was wrong, and that the electrical work had been done exactly according to the approved plans. He said we should push back hard on this ruling, maybe even file a formal complaint about the inspector's interpretation of the code. Frank looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He said quietly that he had reviewed the inspector's concerns and actually thought the inspector was right, that the work did not meet current code standards even if it matched what was on the older approved plans. I watched this exchange with interest, noting the dynamic between Chase's aggressive certainty and Frank's reluctant honesty. I asked Frank what he recommended we do to resolve the situation. He said we should acknowledge the error, eat the cost, fix the work properly, and communicate openly with the client about the delay and our commitment to doing things right. This would cost money and time, but it would maintain the company's reputation for integrity that Dad had worked so hard to build. Chase disagreed vehemently. He said that admitting fault would expose us to liability and would make us look incompetent to the client. Better to fight the inspector's ruling and maintain that our work was correct. If we eventually had to redo it anyway, we could frame it as compliance with an unreasonable interpretation rather than correction of an error. I thought about what I had read in Dad's journal about values and integrity, about the kind of company Dad had wanted Cole Construction to be. I looked at Frank's weathered face and saw a man who had worked in construction long enough to know the difference between cutting corners and doing things right. Then I looked at Chase, seeing someone who prioritized the appearance of competence over the reality of quality work. My decision came more easily than I expected. I told Frank that we would follow his recommendation, that we would acknowledge the issue, fix the work properly, communicate honestly with the client, and absorb the cost as our responsibility. I thanked him for bringing the problem to our attention so quickly and asked him to keep me updated on the progress of the corrections. Frank looked relieved and said he would take care of everything. He left the office with a slight smile on his face, the first smile I had seen from anyone that morning. Chase waited until Frank was gone before exploding. He said I had just made a terrible business decision based on complete ignorance of how construction projects actually worked. Admitting fault on something like this would encourage inspectors to be even more nitpicky in the future, and would signal to clients that we did not know what we were doing. We had just thrown away $40,000 in 2 weeks because I wanted to feel morally superior instead of thinking strategically about protecting the company's interests. I let him finish his tirade, then spoke calmly. I said that Dad had built this company on a reputation for doing quality work even when it cost more or took longer. That reputation was worth far more than $40,000. Clients hired Cole Construction specifically because they trusted us to do things right, not because we were the cheapest or the fastest. If we started compromising on quality or honesty to save money or avoid admitting errors, we would become just another contractor competing purely on price, and we would lose what made us valuable. Chase stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him recalculating his approach. He had expected me to be intimidated by his experience and to defer to his judgment on business matters. Instead, I had just overruled him on a significant decision and articulated a clear philosophy about how I intended to run the company. The power dynamic he had assumed would favor him was not materializing the way he had planned. He stood up abruptly and said he had work to do. He would prepare the reports I requested, but it would take a few days given everything else he was managing. He walked out of the office without waiting for a response, leaving me sitting alone behind Dad's desk. I spent the rest of that day at the Cole Construction office, introducing myself to employees and trying to learn names and roles. People were uniformly polite and seemed genuinely sad about Dad's death. Several told me stories about times he had helped them personally, lending money during family emergencies or offering flexibility when they needed time off for personal matters. One woman in accounting told me that Dad had paid for her son's rehab treatment when her insurance would not cover it, and that her son had been sober for 3 years now because of that intervention. These stories reinforced what I already knew about my father's character, but also made the weight of responsibility feel even heavier. These people had trusted Dad. Now they needed to be able to trust me. Over the following week, I established a routine of spending mornings at the ceramic studio managing my own business, and afternoons at the Cole Construction office learning about Dad's company. Chase was coolly professional during this time, providing the reports I had requested, but offering minimal additional guidance or context. He seemed to be testing whether I would give up and retreat once I realized how complex construction management actually was. But I did not give up. I studied the reports late into the night, teaching myself to read project schedules and financial statements. I asked Frank Morrison and other senior staff members endless questions about how things worked, and they patiently explained construction processes and industry practices. I accompanied crews to job sites to watch the actual work being done, getting a visceral understanding of what Cole Construction created that went far beyond what could be captured in reports and spreadsheets. The more I learned, the more I began to see patterns that troubled me. Chase had been pursuing growth aggressively, taking on more projects than the company could comfortably handle with existing staff. This had led to rushing work, relying more heavily on subcontractors rather than Cole's own trusted crews, and cutting corners in ways that were not obvious to clients, but that compromised the thoroughness that Dad had always insisted on. The company was more profitable under Chase's leadership than it had been under Dad's final years, but that profitability came at the cost of the values that had built the company's reputation in the first place. I realized that Dad had been right to worry about Chase's leadership. Given time and freedom, Chase would transform Cole Construction into a company that prioritized growth and profit above everything else, and eventually that would erode the trust and reputation that were the company's most valuable assets. Dad had not left the company to me because I knew about construction. He had left it to me because he trusted that I would protect what he had built, even if I had to learn an entirely new industry to do it. This understanding gave me clarity about what I needed to do. I could not simply maintain the status quo with Chase running operations. His vision for the company was fundamentally incompatible with Dad's legacy. But I also could not fire him without having a clear plan for who would manage the complex operations he currently oversaw. I needed time and I needed help, but most of all, I needed to stop deferring to Chase's supposed expertise and start trusting my own judgment about what this company should be. The second week of my involvement with Cole Construction brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the office atmosphere. Employees who had initially seemed uncertain about my presence began seeking me out with questions and concerns, testing whether I was genuinely interested in understanding the business or simply going through the motions before selling it off. I made a point of being accessible and attentive, scheduling one-on-one meetings with each department head to learn about their specific areas of responsibility and the challenges they faced in their daily work. During these conversations, a pattern emerged that I had not anticipated. Multiple people mentioned that the past 6 months had been particularly stressful, not just because of Dad's declining health, but because of changes Chase had implemented in how projects were managed and how decisions were made. The changes were never described in overtly critical terms, as employees were clearly reluctant to speak negatively about someone who had been their direct supervisor, but the underlying concerns were evident in the careful language they used and the specific examples they offered. Marcus Rodriguez, the lead estimator who had been with the company for 12 years, explained that Chase had recently started pushing for more aggressive bidding on projects, insisting that they could make up for lower profit margins through volume and efficiency gains. Marcus said this approach made him uncomfortable because it left very little room for error or unexpected complications, which were inevitable in construction work. When issues arose that required additional time or materials, the compressed margins meant the company was either absorbing significant losses or having difficult conversations with clients about cost overruns. Neither outcome was sustainable long-term, and Marcus worried that the company's reputation for reliable budgeting was being damaged. Jennifer Cow, who managed client relationships and new business development, shared her concerns about the types of projects Chase had been pursuing. She explained that Dad had always been selective about which jobs to take on, prioritizing clients who valued quality and had realistic expectations about timelines and costs. Chase, however, had been accepting projects from clients who were primarily motivated by getting the lowest possible price, which inevitably led to conflicts when those clients pushed back against necessary expenses or proper construction practices. Jennifer said she had tried to discuss these concerns with Chase multiple times, but he had dismissed her objections as overcautious and told her that successful businesses needed to be willing to work with all types of clients, not just the easy ones. The most troubling conversation was with David Park, the safety compliance officer whose position Dad had created 3 years ago after a minor job site accident had prompted a comprehensive review of company safety practices. David explained that Chase had been increasingly resistant to the time and expense involved in proper safety protocols, arguing that Cole Construction had an excellent safety record and that some of the measures David insisted on were excessive. David had documentation of several instances where Chase had pressured site supervisors to skip or abbreviate safety briefings in order to keep projects on schedule. Nothing catastrophic had happened yet, but David was worried that it was only a matter of time before someone got seriously injured, and when that happened, the company would face both legal liability and moral responsibility for having prioritized speed over worker safety. These conversations painted a picture that aligned disturbingly well with what I had read in Dad's journal. Chase was not operating with malicious intent, but he had fundamentally different priorities than Dad had held. Where Dad saw construction as a craft that required patience and care and investment in doing things properly, Chase saw it as a business that needed to maximize efficiency and profitability. Both perspectives had merit in the abstract, but for a company that had built its reputation on the former approach, shifting to the latter was eroding the very foundation that made Cole Construction valuable. I began attending the weekly project management meetings where site supervisors and project managers gathered to review progress on all active jobs, discuss upcoming challenges, and coordinate resource allocation. Chase ran these meetings with crisp efficiency, moving through the agenda quickly and making decisions with confident authority. He clearly knew the details of every project intimately and could speak knowledgeably about construction methods, material specifications, and scheduling logistics. His competence was undeniable, which made it harder to articulate exactly what was wrong with his leadership approach. During my third project meeting, a situation arose that crystallized my concerns. Tom Brennan, one of the site supervisors, raised an issue with the Westlake renovation project. He explained that when they had opened up the walls to begin the kitchen remodel, They had discovered that the existing electrical system was much older and more degraded than anyone had anticipated. The wiring was not up to current code standards and posed a potential fire hazard. Tom recommended that they notify the client immediately and propose a comprehensive electrical upgrade for the entire house, not just the kitchen area being renovated. This would add approximately $30,000 to the project cost and extend the timeline by 2 weeks. Chase's response was swift and decisive. He said that notifying the client about problems outside the scope of the contracted work would open a can of worms that could derail the entire project. The client had a fixed budget and was already stretching to afford the kitchen renovation. If they suddenly faced an additional $30,000 in unexpected costs, they might cancel the whole job, leaving Cole Construction with uncompensated design work and lost revenue. Chase instructed Tom to focus on bringing the kitchen electrical up to code as part of the contracted work, but to leave the rest of the house alone since it was outside their scope of responsibility. Tom looked distinctly uncomfortable with this directive. He pointed out that they had discovered a safety hazard, and that failing to inform the homeowner about it felt wrong, regardless of the contractual technicalities. What if there was an electrical fire after they completed the renovation, and it came out that Cole Construction had known about the faulty wiring but had not said anything? Beyond the legal liability, it just seemed like the wrong thing to do to people who had trusted them with their home. Chase's face tightened with irritation. He said that Tom was not a lawyer and should not be making legal or ethical judgments about what the company's obligations were. They had been hired to renovate a kitchen, not to conduct a whole house inspection. Discovering incidental problems did not create a duty to fix everything they found, especially when doing so would impose significant costs on clients who had not budgeted for them. Chase said this was a simple business decision, and that Tom should stick to his job of managing the construction work rather than trying to dictate company policy. The room had gone quiet, with everyone carefully studying their project folders or laptop screens, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between Chase and Tom but unwilling to insert themselves into the conflict. I had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, but I could not let this moment pass without speaking up. I said that I appreciated both perspectives and understood the business concerns Chase was raising, but that I agreed with Tom's instincts about the right course of action. Cole Construction's reputation had been built on being trustworthy and putting client interests first, even when that created short-term complications or costs for the company. Discovering a fire hazard and not informing the homeowner violated that principle in a way that I was not comfortable with. I asked Tom to prepare a detailed assessment of the electrical issues and a proposal for the upgrade work, and I said I would personally call the client to discuss the situation. Chase's jaw clenched, and I could see him working to control his anger at being contradicted in front of the project team. He said that making decisions like this without understanding all the implications was exactly why he had suggested I stay out of operational management until I had more experience. I was about to create a situation where the client might walk away from the project entirely, leaving the company with a half-completed renovation and potential legal disputes about who was responsible for what. I acknowledged that these were legitimate concerns, but said that I would rather deal with a difficult client conversation than lie by omission about a safety issue. If the client chose to cancel the project after learning about the electrical problems, that would be unfortunate, but it would be their informed decision rather than something we had hidden from them. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted noticeably, with project managers now uncertain about whose judgment to defer to when Chase's directives conflicted with what they believed to be the right approach. After the meeting ended, Frank Morrison caught up with me in the hallway. He said quietly that he appreciated what I had done in there, that the team needed to see that the company's values had not changed just because Dad was gone. He told me that there had been several similar situations over recent months where Chase had prioritized business considerations over transparency with clients, and that it had been making people increasingly uncomfortable. Frank said most of the long-term employees had stayed at Cole Construction specifically because they believed in doing work they could be proud of, and they had been worried that was going to change under Chase's leadership. This conversation reinforced my growing conviction that I could not simply step back and let Chase run the company according to his own judgment. The values Dad had built Cole Construction on were not abstract principles that could be compromised for business efficiency. They were the actual substance of what made the company worth preserving. And employees like Frank and Tom and David were counting on me to protect those values even though I was new to the industry and unsure of my own authority. That evening, I called the Westlake renovation clients from my apartment, steeling myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I introduced myself as the new owner of Cole Construction, offered my condolences that they were dealing with this ownership transition in the middle of their project, and then explained what Tom had discovered about their electrical system. I was completely honest about the situation, explaining that the problems were outside the scope of their contracted renovation, but that we felt obligated to inform them because of the potential safety implications. The clients, a couple in their 50s named Robert and Susan Chan, were understandably upset about the unexpected costs and delays this would create. Robert asked pointed questions about why the electrical issues had not been identified during the initial assessment before they signed the contract. I explained that it was impossible to know what was behind walls until you opened them up, and that this was one of the inherent uncertainties in renovation work. I offered to provide the electrical upgrade at our actual cost without any markup, which would save them several $1,000s compared to standard pricing. I also said that if they wanted to get a second opinion from an independent electrician before making any decisions, we would fully support that and would provide access to the work site for their inspector. There was a long silence on the other end of the line while Robert and Susan presumably looked at each other and had a wordless conversation about how to respond. Finally, Susan spoke up, saying that they appreciated our honesty and that many contractors would probably not have told them about problems outside the contracted scope. She said they would need to look at their budget and financing options, but that they wanted to move forward with both the kitchen renovation and the electrical upgrade because living in a house with fire hazards was not acceptable. Robert added that our willingness to do the work at cost and to encourage an independent inspection gave them confidence that we were not trying to take advantage of the situation. We ended the call with an agreement that they would confirm within 48 hours about proceeding with the expanded scope, and that Tom would coordinate access for their electrician to verify our assessment. I felt physically exhausted after that conversation, drained by the emotional labor of delivering bad news and managing client concerns about issues I barely understood from a technical perspective. But I also felt certain that we had done the right thing, and that conviction gave me strength to continue navigating challenges I had never anticipated facing. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Chase waiting for me with a printed spreadsheet showing the financial impact of various decisions I had made over the past 2 weeks. He had clearly spent considerable time compiling this analysis, documenting the cost of fixing the Riverside electrical work, the reduced profit margin from doing the Westlake electrical upgrade at cost, and several other instances where my choices had prioritized client relationships or quality standards over immediate financial return. According to his calculations, my decision-making had cost the company nearly $80,000 in just 2 weeks. Chase presented this information with the air of someone revealing damning evidence that proved his point beyond argument. He said that if I continued making decisions based on idealistic notions about integrity and client service without regard for financial realities, Cole Construction would be bankrupt within a year. Construction was a low-margin business where profitability depended on careful cost management and efficient execution. We could not afford to absorb tens of thousands of dollars in unexpected expenses every time we encountered complications or chose to exceed our contractual obligations. I listened to his entire presentation without interrupting, studying the spreadsheet and following his logic. When he finished, I asked him a question. Over the past 5 years, what percentage of Cole Construction's new business had come from referrals and repeat clients versus competitive bidding processes? Chase looked puzzled by the question, clearly not seeing how it related to his financial analysis. He said he did not have that data immediately available, but estimated that maybe 40% came from existing relationships while the majority came from bidding on new projects. I asked Jennifer Cow to join us, and when she arrived, I posed the same question to her. Jennifer did not need to consult any records. She said that actually about 75% of their revenue came from repeat clients and referrals, and that this had been true consistently throughout the company's history. Dad had always emphasized relationship building over competitive bidding, because clients who hired Cole Construction based on reputation were willing to pay fair prices for quality work, while clients who selected contractors based purely on price were much more difficult to work with and much less profitable overall. I turned back to Chase and explained my thinking. The $80,000 he was framing as wasted money was actually an investment in maintaining the reputation that generated 75% of our business. Clients like the Chens were going to tell their friends and family about how Cole Construction had discovered a safety problem and insisted on fixing it, even though it complicated the project and cost us money. That story would bring us future clients who valued integrity and quality, which were exactly the clients we wanted. Conversely, if we developed a reputation for cutting corners or hiding problems to protect our margins, we would lose access to the referral network that was our primary source of business and would be forced to compete purely on price in the open market, which would be far more costly in the long run. Chase shook his head in frustration, saying that I was rationalizing poor business decisions with theoretical arguments about reputation and relationships. He said that in the real world, companies that consistently prioritized expenses over revenue did not survive, regardless of how good their intentions were. He suggested again that I should step back from operational decisions until I better understood the financial realities of running a construction company. Jennifer, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious discomfort, spoke up unexpectedly. She said that actually, Chase's approach over the past 6 months had started to damage the company's reputation in the local design and architecture community. Several designers who had previously been regular sources of referrals had quietly stopped recommending Cole Construction because they had heard concerning things about rushed work and cost-cutting measures. Jennifer said she had been trying to address these concerns, but the pattern of behavior was making it increasingly difficult to maintain the relationships that had historically been the company's strength. The expression on Chase's face shifted from frustrated certainty to something closer to anger. He told Jennifer that her job was client management, not questioning company strategy, and that if she had concerns about operational decisions, she should have brought them to him privately rather than undermining his authority in front of the owner. Jennifer's face flushed, but she held her ground, saying that she had tried to raise these issues with him multiple times, and that he had dismissed her concerns as overcautious and resistant to necessary changes. I intervened before the situation could escalate further, thanking Jennifer for her honesty and telling Chase that we would continue this conversation privately. After Jennifer left, I told Chase directly that his dismissiveness toward employee concerns was a problem that needed to stop. People like Jennifer and Tom and Frank had decades of combined experience in this industry and had been loyal to Dad specifically because he respected their judgment and listened to their expertise. Treating them as subordinates whose role was simply to execute his decisions without question was not acceptable, and would lead to losing the institutional knowledge and client relationships that made Cole Construction valuable. Chase stood abruptly, saying that it was impossible to run a company when the owner constantly second-guessed every decision and encouraged employees to go around the chain of command. He said he was trying to do what was best for the business, but I was making it impossible for him to do his job effectively. He walked out of the office, leaving me alone with the spreadsheet that documented all the ways my leadership was supposedly costing the company money. I spent the rest of that day feeling deeply uncertain about whether I was making terrible mistakes or necessary corrections. Chase's financial analysis was not wrong in its specifics. The decisions I had made did have immediate costs that affected the bottom line. But I kept coming back to Jennifer's comment about the company's reputation beginning to suffer, and to Frank's earlier observation that employees needed to see that the company's values had not changed. These seemed like longer-term strategic considerations that were harder to quantify on a spreadsheet, but were ultimately more important than any individual project's profit margin. That weekend, I did something I had been avoiding since Dad's death. I went through boxes of his personal papers that had been stored in the garage at the Maple Street house, looking for anything that might provide additional insight into his thinking about the business and about Chase's role in it. Most of what I found was unremarkable old tax returns and insurance policies and correspondence about routine matters. But in one box, I discovered a folder labeled Succession Planning that contained documents I had never seen before. The folder included multiple drafts of Dad's will from different time periods, showing how his thinking had evolved over the final 2 years of his life. The earliest version, dated about 18 months before his death, left everything to Chase with only a small cash bequest to me. But subsequent versions showed progressive changes, first adding conditions and oversight mechanisms to Chase's inheritance, then splitting assets more evenly between us, and finally arriving at the version that left me with the company and the house while Chase received only the cash payment and the truck. More revealing than the will drafts were the notes Dad had written to himself, working through his reasoning and struggling with the decision. He wrote about his desire to believe in Chase, about his hope that the concerning behaviors he was seeing were temporary mistakes that Chase would learn from rather than fundamental character issues. He documented specific incidents that troubled him, conversations with employees who had raised concerns, and his own observations of Chase's decision-making. He wrote about the pain of acknowledging that his son was not the person he had hoped he would be, and about the fear that leaving the company to Chase would ultimately destroy everything he had built. Reading these notes, I understood that Dad's decision had not been made lightly or out of favoritism toward me. It had been the culmination of months of observation and painful acceptance that Chase could not be trusted with his legacy. Dad had given Chase every opportunity to demonstrate that he had learned from his mistakes and understood the values that Cole Construction was built on. Chase had instead doubled down on his own approach, apparently convinced that Dad's methods were outdated and that his own more aggressive strategy was superior. The folder also contained a sealed envelope with my name on it, in Dad's handwriting. I opened it carefully and found a letter addressed to me, dated just 3 weeks before his death. The letter began with Dad's acknowledgement that by the time I read this, I would probably be feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about whether I could manage the responsibility he had given me. He wrote that he understood I had no experience in construction, and that Chase would likely challenge my authority and question my decisions. He said he had nevertheless chosen to leave the company to me because he trusted my judgment and your values in ways he could no longer trust Chase's. Dad's letter went on to offer specific advice about how to approach leadership of Cole Construction. He said that I should not try to become an expert in construction, because that was not what the company needed from me. The company had plenty of people with technical expertise. What it needed was someone who would protect its fundamental values and make decisions based on long-term sustainability, rather than short-term profit maximization. He said I should listen carefully to people like Frank and Jennifer and David, because they understood what made Cole Construction special, and they would help guide me toward good decisions if I was willing to trust their expertise. Most importantly, Dad wrote that I should not feel guilty about whatever happened with Chase. He said Chase was an adult who had made his own choices and would need to live with the consequences of those choices. Dad had tried to teach Chase what mattered, but Chase had chosen a different path. That was not my fault, and I should not sacrifice the company's future or my own peace of mind trying to accommodate Chase's expectations or manage his feelings about the inheritance. The letter ended with words that brought tears to my eyes. Dad wrote that he was proud of what I had built with my ceramics business, that creating beautiful and functional art was valuable work that brought goodness into the world. He said he had watched me handle challenges and setbacks with grace and determination, and that those qualities would serve me well in the challenges ahead. He believed in me, and he hoped I would come to believe in myself as a leader even though this was not a role I had ever sought or prepared for. I sat in the garage holding that letter for a long time, crying for the father I had lost, and for the weight of responsibility he had placed on my shoulders. But underneath the grief and the uncertainty, I felt something else beginning to emerge. It was a kind of determined clarity, a sense that I needed to stop questioning whether I belonged in this role and start fully stepping into it. Dad had not left me Cole Construction because he thought I would maintain the status quo. He had left it to me because he trusted I would make the hard decisions necessary to protect what mattered, even when those decisions were uncomfortable or costly. The following Monday, I arrived at the office early and asked Paula to schedule a company-wide meeting for later that morning. When employees gathered in the large conference room, I could see concern and curiosity on their faces. There had been obvious tension between Chase and me over the past few weeks, and people were clearly worried about what this meeting might mean for their jobs and the company's future. I stood at the front of the room and spoke from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. I told them that I knew they had been dealing with uncertainty about leadership and direction since Dad's death, and that I wanted to be clear about my vision for Cole Construction going forward. I said that I was still learning about the construction industry, and that I would make mistakes as I learned, but that my fundamental commitment was to maintaining the values and standards that Dad had built the company on. Quality work, honest dealing with clients, respect for employees, and a long-term perspective that prioritized reputation over immediate profit would continue to be what defined how we operated. I acknowledged that this approach would sometimes mean turning down projects that did not fit our standards, accepting lower margins to do things properly, and making decisions that cost money in the short term but protected the company's integrity in the long term. I said I understood that some people might prefer a more aggressive growth strategy, and that if my approach was not aligned with what they wanted in an employer, I would respect that and would not hold it against them if they chose to seek opportunities elsewhere. But for those who stayed, I promised that I would listen to their expertise, trust their professional judgment, and support them in doing work they could be proud of. I said that Cole Construction under my ownership would continue to be the kind of company where people felt good about coming to work each day, because they knew they were building things that would last and treating clients with respect and integrity. The response to this short speech was more emotional than I had anticipated. Several people approached me afterward to say they were relieved to hear that the company's values were not going to change, that they had been worried about the direction things were heading, and were glad to have clarity about the future. A few people even thanked me for stepping up to lead the company even though it was not what I had planned for my life, saying they could see Dad's influence in the way I was approaching the responsibility. Chase did not attend the company meeting. I learned from Paula that he had called in sick that morning, though she said this with a tone that suggested she did not believe the illness was physical. Over the following days, Chase's presence at the office became increasingly sporadic. He would come in for a few hours to handle urgent matters, but he avoided meetings and interactions where he might have to work directly with me. The message was clear. He was disengaging from the company rather than accepting his reduced role under my ownership. I knew this situation could not continue indefinitely. Chase's knowledge of ongoing projects was still essential to operations, and his withdrawal was creating gaps in project management that other people had to scramble to fill. We needed to have a direct conversation about his future with the company, but I was reluctant to force that conversation because I knew it would likely result in his departure, and I was not yet confident that we could manage without him. The decision was made for me when Frank Morrison came to my office with concerning news. He said that Chase had been in contact with several key subcontractors and suppliers, telling them that the company was going to be sold soon, and that they should expect disruptions in payment and contract terms during the transition. This was completely false as I had no plans to sell, but Chase was apparently trying to destabilize relationships and create problems that would make my leadership more difficult. Frank said he had managed to reassure most of the subcontractors that nothing was changing, but the fact that Chase was actively working to undermine the company's operations was a serious problem that needed to be addressed immediately. That evening, I drove to the Maple Street house where Chase was still living in the master bedroom he had claimed. It was time for a conversation I had been avoiding, a conversation that would permanently alter whatever remained of our sibling relationship. The next phase of this difficult journey was about to begin, and I knew there was no way through it except forward. I arrived at the Maple Street house just after 7 in the evening, parking behind Chase's truck in the driveway. The house was fully lit, suggesting he was home, though part of me wondered if he might refuse to answer the door once he realized I was there. Our relationship had deteriorated so dramatically over the past few weeks that normal sibling communication had become nearly impossible, replaced by tense exchanges about business matters and long periods of avoidance. I used my key to enter, calling out Chase's name as I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled like takeout food, and I could hear the television playing in the living room. Chase appeared in the hallway, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness when he saw me. He was wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, looking more casual and vulnerable than the confident business professional he projected at the office. For a moment, I saw him as simply my older brother rather than the adversary he had become in matters related to Dad's estate. I asked if we could talk, and Chase gestured toward the kitchen table where we had eaten countless family meals growing up. We sat down across from each other in the same chairs we had occupied since childhood. A spatial arrangement that felt both familiar and deeply strange given the current state of our relationship. I had rehearsed various approaches to this conversation during the drive over, but now that the moment had arrived, all my prepared language seemed inadequate to the task. I started by telling Chase directly what Frank had reported about his communications with subcontractors and suppliers. I watched his face carefully as I explained that spreading false information about the company being sold and creating uncertainty among business partners was not acceptable behavior from anyone, much less from someone who was supposed to be helping manage operations during this transition period. Chase did not deny the allegations, which told me everything I needed to know about their accuracy. Instead of defending himself, Chase launched into an attack. He said that I had left him no choice but to take action to protect his interests and the interests of the company's long-term viability. He claimed that my inexperienced leadership was driving coal construction toward failure, and that someone needed to prepare for the inevitable collapse by maintaining relationships with key partners who would be essential to rebuilding whatever emerged from the wreckage. He framed his undermining behavior as a form of contingency planning rather than sabotage, as though he were being prudent and forward-thinking rather than deliberately destructive. The reasoning was so transparently self-serving that I almost laughed, but the situation was too serious for humor. I told Chase that his analysis of my leadership was irrelevant to the fact that he had actively worked to damage the company's business relationships. Even if he genuinely believed I was incompetent, spreading misinformation to suppliers and subcontractors harmed coal construction and its employees, not just me personally. His actions demonstrated that he cared more about being proven right about my supposed failures than about the well-being of the company Dad had spent his life building. Chase's face flushed with anger, and his voice rose as he responded. He said I had no right to lecture him about loyalty to Dad's company when I had stolen it from him through manipulation and deception. He repeated his conviction that I had somehow influenced Dad to change his will during his final illness, taking advantage of a sick man's vulnerability to secure an inheritance I had not earned and did not deserve. The accusation was so disconnected from reality that I wondered if Chase actually believed it, or if it was simply a narrative he had constructed to avoid confronting his own responsibility for Dad's decision. I pulled out my phone and showed Chase photographs I had taken of Dad's succession planning folder, including the multiple will drafts that showed the evolution of his thinking over 18 months. I explained that Dad's decision had not been a last-minute change made under dubious circumstances, but rather the result of careful consideration and repeated revisions as he observed Chase's behavior and decision-making over an extended period. I told Chase about the private investigator Dad had hired, about the discovery of the kickback scheme, and about Dad's fundamental loss of confidence in Chase's judgment and integrity. The color drained from Chase's face as I provided this information. He had clearly not known that Dad was aware of the kickbacks, and the realization that his father had died knowing about his ethical violations seemed to hit him with genuine force. For a moment I thought I saw something like shame or remorse in his expression, a crack in the defensive anger that had characterized all our recent interactions. But the moment passed quickly, and Chase's face hardened again into stubborn resistance. He claimed that the kickbacks were standard industry practice, that every construction company dealt with similar arrangements with preferred subcontractors, and that Dad's objection to them reflected an old-fashioned and unrealistic view of how modern business worked. He said Dad had been too rigid and too focused on outdated principles that limited the company's growth potential. Chase insisted that if Dad had given him real authority instead of constantly questioning his decisions, he could have transformed coal construction into something much larger and more profitable than the small regional company it had remained under Dad's conservative leadership. This response revealed the core of the problem more clearly than anything else Chase could have said. He genuinely believed that the values Dad had built the company on were obstacles to success, rather than the foundation of its reputation and sustainability. He saw growth and profit as the primary measures of business achievement, while Dad had viewed integrity and quality as the metrics that actually mattered. This was not a difference of opinion about tactics or strategy. It was a fundamental disagreement about what constituted success and what kind of legacy was worth building. I told Chase that I finally understood why Dad had made the choice he did, and that I no longer had any doubt about whether that choice was correct. Chase had just explicitly articulated that he did not share Dad's values, and did not intend to honor them in managing the company. Given that reality, Dad had been absolutely right to ensure that Chase would not have the authority to transform coal construction into something that contradicted everything it had stood for during its 23-year history. Chase stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the kitchen floor. He said that this conversation was pointless, that I had clearly made up my mind to believe the worst about him regardless of what he said or did. He claimed that I was using Dad's notes and letters as justification for my own desire to cut him out of the company, and that the real motivation was my jealousy of his relationship with Dad and his success in the construction industry. He said I was going to destroy coal construction through incompetent leadership, and that when that happened, he would feel no sympathy because I had brought it on myself by refusing to listen to his guidance and expertise. I let him finish his speech, then spoke calmly and clearly. I told Chase that effective immediately, he was no longer employed by Cole Construction. I would provide him with 3 months of severance pay, which was more generous than the situation warranted given his recent behavior, but which I was offering out of respect for the years he had worked alongside Dad. He needed to remove his personal belongings from the office by the end of the week, and he needed to vacate the Maple Street house within 30 days. I would not contest his right to the $50,000 and the truck that Dad had left him, and I hoped that eventually we might be able to repair our relationship as siblings even though we could no longer work together professionally. Chase stared at me in disbelief, as though he could not quite process what I had just said. He asked if I was seriously firing him from the company he had helped build, from the work he had devoted 10 years of his life to mastering. His voice carried a note of genuine shock, suggesting that despite all the conflict and tension, he had not actually believed I would take this step. He had apparently convinced himself that my inexperience and uncertainty would prevent me from making such a decisive move, that I would ultimately back down and accept his continued presence because I needed his expertise too much to do without it. I confirmed that yes, I was terminating his employment, and that the decision was final and not subject to negotiation. I explained that I could not have someone actively working against the company's interests, while holding a position of authority and trust. His recent behavior with the subcontractors had made it impossible to continue the current arrangement, and his statements during this conversation had made it clear that there was no path forward that would involve him respecting my ownership and authority. The situation was unfortunate, but it was also necessary. Chase's shock transformed rapidly into fury. He said I would regret this decision, that the company would fall apart without his knowledge and relationships, and that I would be forced to come begging for his help within months when I realized I could not manage the complexity of construction operations. He predicted that clients would cancel contracts, employees would quit, and projects would fail because I lacked the competence to provide the leadership the company required. He said he looked forward to watching me fail spectacularly and publicly, proving that Dad had made a catastrophic mistake in leaving the company to someone who knew nothing about the industry. The venom in his voice was startling, revealing depths of resentment and hostility that went far beyond reasonable anger about an unexpected inheritance outcome. Chase was not just upset about losing the company. He seemed genuinely to hate me, to want me to suffer and fail in ways that would vindicate his sense of entitlement and grievance. I realized that whatever sibling relationship we had once shared was probably irretrievable, damaged beyond any realistic hope of repair by the toxic combination of Dad's death, the inheritance dispute, and our fundamental disagreements about values and leadership. I stood up to leave, telling Chase that I would have his final paycheck and severance package ready by the end of the week, and that I expected him to conduct himself professionally during the transition of his responsibilities to other team members. He did not respond, just stared at me with an expression of cold rage that made me deeply uncomfortable. I left the house quickly, feeling shaken by the confrontation but also certain that I had made the right decision even though it was painful and difficult. The drive back to my apartment took me through the quiet streets of Southeast Portland, past houses where families were settling in for ordinary evenings with no idea of the drama playing out in other people's lives. I thought about how radically my life had changed in just a few weeks, from being a ceramics artist with a small successful business to being the owner of a construction company, facing serious internal challenges and family conflicts. Nothing about this situation matched anything I had imagined for my future. And yet here I was making decisions that affected dozens of people's livelihoods and the legacy of a man I had loved and respected more than anyone else in the world. When I arrived home, I called Robert Chun to inform him of Chase's termination and to ask about any legal implications I needed to consider. Chun listened carefully to my description of the situation and then assured me that I was well within my rights as the business owner to terminate Chase's employment, particularly given the evidence of his attempts to undermine the company's operations. Chun suggested documenting everything thoroughly in case Chase attempted to take legal action, though he doubted that any lawsuit would be successful given the clear evidence of Chase's inappropriate behavior. He also reminded me that the house situation was entirely separate from the employment matter, and that Chase's 30-day notice to vacate was more than legally required. Over the following days, The reality of Chase's departure began to reshape the dynamics at Cole Construction. I met with Frank Morrison, Jennifer Cow, and the other senior staff members to explain that Chase was no longer with the company and that his responsibilities would be distributed among the existing project management team. I was honest about the reasons for his departure, explaining that there had been fundamental disagreements about company values and direction that made it impossible to continue working together. The response from the team was overwhelmingly positive, with multiple people privately expressing relief that they would no longer have to navigate the tension between Chase's directives and their own professional judgment about the right way to handle various situations. Frank agreed to take on the role of interim operations director, coordinating the work of the various project managers and serving as my primary point of contact for operational matters. He had been with the company long enough to understand all the systems and relationships, and he had the respect of both the employees and the subcontractor community. His steady, methodical approach to problem-solving was exactly what the company needed during this period of transition and uncertainty. Jennifer took on expanded responsibilities for client communication and relationship management, ensuring that all existing clients understood that Cole Construction remained committed to completing their projects according to the original agreements and quality standards. She reached out personally to every active client to introduce herself as their primary point of contact and to assure them that the company's ownership transition would not affect the quality or timeline of their work. Her professionalism and warmth in these conversations went a long way toward maintaining client confidence during what could have been a period of significant uncertainty. David Park worked with Frank to reinforce safety protocols across all job sites, making it clear that the recent pressure to cut corners on safety procedures would no longer be tolerated. He conducted site visits to review practices with each crew and to ensure that everyone understood that safety was a non-negotiable priority, regardless of schedule pressures or client demands. The response from the field crews was positive, with several supervisors privately thanking him for taking this stand and acknowledging that they had been uncomfortable with some of the shortcuts they had been pressured to accept in recent months. As these pieces fell into place, I began to see that the company had more institutional strength and resilience than I had given it credit for. Dad had built something that was larger than any single person, even himself. The values and systems and relationships he had established over 23 years had created an organization that could continue to function effectively as long as someone was willing to protect those foundational principles. My role was not to become an expert in construction or to replicate Dad's specific management style. My role was to ensure that decisions were made according to the values that had always defined Cole Construction, and to trust the expertise of people who knew far more than I did about the technical aspects of the work. This realization was liberating in some ways, but it also created new pressure. If the company succeeded under my ownership, it would validate Dad's decision to leave it to me instead of to Chase. If it failed, it would suggest that Chase had been right about my incompetence and that Dad had made a terrible mistake in prioritizing values over operational experience. The stakes felt impossibly high, not just for my own sense of competence but for the legacy of a man who could no longer defend his choices or see whether his faith in me had been justified. 3 weeks after firing Chase, I received a call from Marcus Rodriguez, asking if I could come to the office to discuss a problem with one of our bids. When I arrived, Marcus explained that he had been reviewing files in preparation for an upcoming proposal and had discovered irregularities in several recent bids that Chase had submitted. The numbers did not match Marcus's calculations, and when he dug deeper, he found that Chase had been systematically underbidding on projects by excluding certain costs or making unrealistic assumptions about efficiency and timeline. These aggressive bids had won several contracts, but the projects were now running significantly over budget because the actual costs were higher than what Chase had estimated and what had been built into the contract price. Marcus showed me a detailed analysis of 6 different projects where this pattern appeared, representing a combined potential loss of over $200,000 if the projects were completed according to the original contracts without successful change orders to recover the additional costs. Some of these cost overruns could potentially be billed to clients as legitimate changes in scope or unforeseen conditions, but others were simply the result of poor estimating or deliberate lowballing to win contracts. Marcus said he had tried to raise concerns about Chase's bidding approach several times, but Chase had dismissed his objections and told him to focus on his assigned work rather than questioning leadership decisions. This discovery was deeply troubling on multiple levels. The immediate financial impact was significant and potentially serious for the company's stability. But beyond the money, the situation revealed that Chase's problematic decision-making had extended into areas I had not yet examined, and that there were likely other issues still hidden in various aspects of company operations. I asked Marcus to conduct a comprehensive review of all active projects and recent bids, identifying any other situations where costs appeared to have been underestimated, or where the company faced potential losses due to contract terms that did not adequately protect our interests. Over the following week, Marcus worked with the accounting staff to complete this analysis. The results were worse than I had hoped but not as catastrophic as I had feared. In addition to the 6 projects he had initially identified, there were 3 others with significant budget issues, bringing the total potential loss to approximately $300,000. However, Marcus believed that through careful project management, strategic use of change orders for legitimate scope changes, and negotiation with clients about cost sharing for certain unforeseen conditions, they could likely reduce the actual loss to something in the range of $100,000 to $150,000. This was still a substantial hit to the company's finances, but it was manageable and would not threaten the company's overall viability. I met with Frank and Marcus to develop a strategy for addressing each problematic project individually. Frank's decades of experience in construction gave him credibility with clients when discussing project complications and cost issues. He could speak knowledgeably about why certain work had turned out to be more complex than anticipated, and could present change orders in ways that felt reasonable rather than like the company was trying to escape from its contractual obligations. Marcus worked with the project managers to document everything thoroughly, building clear records that would support any necessary negotiations or, in worst-case scenarios, any disputes that might end up in mediation or litigation. As we worked through these issues one by one, I gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity of construction project management and the importance of honest, accurate estimating. Every project involved dozens of decisions about materials, methods, labor allocation, and timeline, and each of those decisions carried financial implications that accumulated into the overall budget. Trying to win contracts by lowballing the estimates was a short-term strategy that created long-term problems, damaging both profitability and client relationships when the inevitable cost overruns emerged. Dad's more conservative approach to bidding had meant winning fewer contracts, but the projects they did win were profitable and created satisfied clients who became sources of referrals and repeat business. One particularly difficult situation involved a commercial renovation project for a small business owner named Karen Williams, who had hired Cole Construction to update her retail space. Chase had bid the project aggressively to beat out 2 competing contractors, and the contract price was now clearly insufficient to cover the actual costs of completing the work to the promised specifications. Frank and I met with Karen to discuss the situation honestly, explaining that there had been errors in the original estimate and presenting her with options for how to proceed. Karen was understandably upset, feeling that she had relied on our professional expertise to provide an accurate bid, and that the cost increase was not her responsibility. She pointed out that she had a signed contract that specified both the scope of work and the price, and that she expected Cole Construction to honor that agreement. Her position was legally and ethically reasonable, and I recognized that this was one of the situations where we would simply have to absorb the loss as a consequence of Chase's poor estimating. I told Karen that she was absolutely right, that we had made a commitment and would honor it regardless of the financial impact on our company. I apologized for the stress and uncertainty that our internal problems had created for her project, and I assured her that the work would be completed exactly as specified in the original contract at the original price. I also offered her a 5-year warranty on all the work, which was longer than our standard warranty, as a gesture of goodwill and our commitment to making the situation right despite our mistakes. Karen's expression softened as I made these commitments. She said she appreciated our honesty and our willingness to take responsibility for the problem, rather than trying to push the costs onto her. She mentioned that she had heard good things about Cole Construction's integrity from other business owners, and that this situation was testing whether that reputation was deserved. The fact that we were choosing to honor our contract, even when it meant significant financial loss, told her that the reputation was genuine, and that she could trust us to complete her project properly. This conversation was difficult and expensive, costing the company approximately $35,000 that we would never recover. But it also reinforced the principle that had guided Dad throughout his career, and that I was trying to maintain in my leadership. When you make a mistake, you own it and you make it right, even when that is costly and uncomfortable. The short-term financial pain was preferable to the long-term reputational damage that would come from trying to escape our obligations or shift our errors onto clients who had trusted us. As these various project issues were gradually resolved, the financial impact became clearer. The total loss from Chase's aggressive bidding and poor project management would be approximately $130,000 after all the mitigation strategies had been implemented. This was a significant amount, but the company's financial reserves were sufficient to absorb it without threatening operations or payroll. More importantly, the way we handled these situations reinforced Cole Construction's reputation for integrity and created stronger relationships with several clients who saw firsthand how we dealt with adversity and mistakes. I also discovered during this period that Chase had made commitments to several potential clients for projects that would begin in the coming months, projects that he had bid on without proper review or approval. Some of these bids were reasonable and represented work we could take on successfully. Others were problematic, either because the pricing was inadequate or because the scope of work was outside our usual expertise and capabilities. I worked with Frank and Marcus to review each of these commitments carefully, deciding which ones to honor and which ones to withdraw from before contracts were finalized. In 3 cases, I made the difficult decision to contact potential clients and explain that we would not be able to take on their projects, after all due to capacity constraints and schedule conflicts. This was embarrassing and professionally awkward, as we were essentially backing out of preliminary agreements that Chase had made on the company's behalf. However, in each case I tried to help the client find alternative contractors who could serve them well, providing referrals to reputable companies that I had learned about through industry connections. 2 of the 3 clients appreciated this honesty and said they would consider Cole Construction for future projects when our capacity allowed. The 3rd was angry about the last-minute withdrawal and made it clear that we would not have opportunities to work with them in the future, which was unfortunate, but seemed like a reasonable consequence of our unreliability. Through all of these challenges and complications, a pattern emerged that was simultaneously encouraging and sobering. The pattern was that the company had significant strengths in its people, its systems, and its reputation, but that Chase's leadership during Dad's final months had created numerous problems that would take time and money to fully resolve. Every week seemed to bring some new discovery of a situation that needed to be addressed, a relationship that needed to be repaired, or a commitment that needed to be honored despite unfavorable terms. It was exhausting and frequently discouraging, but it was also manageable because the fundamental structure Dad had built was sound enough to withstand the strain. What kept me going during this difficult period was the support and dedication of the core team. Frank and Jennifer and Marcus and David and the other long-term employees understood what the company was supposed to be, and they were committed to helping restore it to that standard. They worked long hours addressing problems and cleaning up messes, and they did so with genuine care for the company's future, rather than simply punching a clock and collecting a paycheck. Their loyalty was not to me personally, as I was still relatively new to them, but to the vision and values that Dad had established and that I was trying to protect. That shared commitment created a sense of common purpose that made the challenges feel surmountable, rather than overwhelming. 6 weeks after firing Chase, I received a letter from an attorney representing him. The letter claimed that Chase had been wrongfully terminated from his position at Cole Construction, and that he was entitled to significant damages for lost wages, emotional distress, and damage to his professional reputation. The letter demanded reinstatement to his former position with back pay, or alternatively, a settlement payment of $500,000 to resolve all claims. The legal threat was not unexpected, but it still created a knot of anxiety in my stomach when I read the formal language and the aggressive demands. I forwarded the letter immediately to Robert Chun, who reviewed it and then called me to discuss the situation. Chun said that the claims were without merit given Chase's at-will employment status and the documented evidence of his inappropriate behavior, including spreading misinformation to subcontractors. However, defending against even a frivolous lawsuit would involve time and legal expenses, and there was always some risk that a jury might be sympathetic to Chase's position as the son who had worked alongside his father for years only to be cut out of the inheritance and then fired by his younger sister. Chun recommended responding with a firm rejection of the claims and a detailed account of the reasons for Chase's termination, making it clear that we were prepared to defend ourselves vigorously if he chose to pursue litigation. The legal threat added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation, but it also clarified something important. Chase was not going to accept his reduced circumstances gracefully or move on with his life in a constructive direction. He was going to fight and create problems and attempt to damage me and the company in whatever ways he could. This was not simply about the inheritance or the job. It was about his need to be proven right and to see me fail in ways that would validate his sense of grievance. Understanding this helped me accept that there was no path to reconciliation or peaceful coexistence with my brother, at least not in the foreseeable future. The relationship was broken, and trying to fix it would only create additional opportunities for him to cause harm. The pattern that had emerged over these weeks was clear. Chase's tenure in leadership had created numerous problems across multiple areas of company operations. Addressing those problems required systematic work, honest communication with clients and partners, willingness to absorb financial losses when necessary, an unwavering commitment to the values that defined Cole Construction's identity. It was difficult and often discouraging work, but it was also revealing that the company was resilient enough to survive the challenges and to emerge stronger on the other side. Each problem we solved and each relationship we repaired reinforced my growing confidence that I could actually do this, that Dad's faith in me had not been misplaced, and that Cole Construction would survive this transition and continue to honor his legacy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.